In the book of Acts, Luke tells the story of the day of Pentecost, the day that we often cite as the birthday of the church. And like the other stories that ground our major feasts and celebrations in the church year, the story from Acts has become quite familiar to those of us who've heard it year after year. Jesus commissions his disciples, he instructs them to wait in Jerusalem, and then is taken up into heaven. The disciples do as they're told and wait in prayer. The Holy Spirit comes, and the church is born. What's missing from this summary is the fantastical language and imagery that Luke uses. It's tempting for us in our present moment to skip over or brush past the descriptions and parts of the Gospel's narratives and of Acts narratives that we just can't quite explain, and that become nothing more than extraneous details. I wonder, though, if this truncated version of the story doesn't leave us with a truncated understanding of what it is that we celebrate this day. I wonder if the fantastical language and imagery is actually an integral and vital part of what Luke is intending to communicate. Luke's language helps us to understand something of the nature of the Holy Spirit. The suddenness of the rushing, violent wind, the sound filling the entire house where the disciples were staying, the sudden appearance of divided tongues of flame resting on the disciples, and their immediate ability to speak in new languages. All of this is meant to convey the disruptive nature of the Spirit. Not only was the coming of the Spirit disruptive for the disciples, but also to all of those who were passing by. God's gift of the Spirit wasn't specifically for the disciples. Rather, this gift was intended for the peoples of the whole world. Out of the din of voices, each onlooker heard in their own language the disciples' proclamation of the mighty deeds of God. But somehow, this bewildering, disruptive event that they witnessed did not lead to chaos, but rather to understanding. How is that possible? Some biblical scholars would or like to think of Pentecost as a reversal of the story of the Tower of Babel. In Genesis chapter 11, we read that humankind had one language, and that in their attempt to keep from being scattered throughout the world, they devised a plan to build the city of cities. However, God disapproved of that plan, and in order to keep them from being successful, God confused their language, and scattered them throughout the world. Many interpretations of this passage consider the sin of Babel to be that the builders of the city were trying to usurp God. They were, it seems, on track to succeed, and so God thwarted their plans, and in their scattering, confuses their language. Rabbi Shai Held offers another way of looking at the Tower of Babel story. Instead of seeing humankind as grasping at equality with God, he sees their resistance to God's command to fill the earth, to multiply, and to be fruitful. In other words, Rabbi Held suggests what Rabbi Held suggests is that what is at stake in this story is not humanity's desire to be God, but humanity's desire for sameness, for uniformity. If this continued without disruption, humankind would sink into the abyss of anonymity. And Rabbi Held sees that the punishment of the confusion of languages, what is normally interpreted as such, is actually a reaffirmation of God's intent for humankind to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth in the kind of diverse patterns that God created. And this interpretation resonates with me because, let's face it, all we need to do is look at the diversity of creation to see that God delights in difference. Whether or not we see Pentecost as the reversal of Babel, what is affirmed in God's gift of the Spirit is God's plan for and delight in the diversity of human being. The Spirit's gift of languages at Pentecost is not some call to a pre-Babel moment or existence of unity as uniformity, but rather as a declaration that unity is the very product of diversity. The languages gifted to the disciples that day of Pentecost was the divine affirmation that God comes to us in the midst of our lived experiences, that God speaks to us in languages that we can understand, that the thing that is being removed from the diverse scattering of the peoples is not difference, but misunderstanding. In our gospel reading today, John tells us that Jesus breathed the Spirit onto the disciples. Prior to his passion, death, and resurrection, Jesus told the disciples that the Spirit is the Spirit of truth, who will lead them into all truth. What an incredible promise to keep hold of. This is a significant moment in God's salvation history. Language is the primary way that we interpret the world around us, the way we name and abide in truth. Language allows us to make meaning of our lives. The Spirit's gift of languages was about much more than the practical equipping of the disciples to carry out their task to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. At the heart of this gift, again, is the proclamation that God comes to us in our lived experiences, that there is no cultural boundary that God is unable to cross, and that the Spirit of truth is present and leading us into understanding. When the onlooker saw the disciples and heard the mighty acts of God being proclaimed in their own language, they were all amazed and perplexed. Here was a group of people who witnessed the sudden, disruptive power of the Spirit. The path to understanding was opened. They heard the mighty deeds of God being proclaimed in their own language, but more importantly, they heard the deeds of God being proclaimed in someone else's language. Some of them wondered, what does this mean? While some others sneered and accused them of being drunk. And I wonder if the responses that Luke records of the onlookers is maybe a little bit telling of the way that we tend to respond to the Spirit's movement. When we hear of other people's experiences of God, when we hear the mighty acts of God being proclaimed in ways that don't line up with our own experiences, what is our response? Do we sneer? Do we question the validity of the proclamation? Do we hold so tightly to our own experience and language, that all other experiences and languages become extraneous to our understanding of truth. How might we reckon this with Peter's interpretation that Pentecost ought to be understood through the lens of Joel, who proclaims that the Spirit of God will be poured out upon all flesh? I wonder, dear people of grace, what boundaries of unlikeness might God be calling and equipping us to transgress? What visions and dreams is God giving us for the next chapter of life together? Where are we noticing the disruptive presence of the Spirit? My prayer for us today on this Pentecost Sunday is that we might find within the diversity of God's creation not only understanding of one another's lived experiences, but that we might discover that the blessing of diversity is found in the dreams and the visions and the prophecies that fuel our capacity to imagine a world where difference is no longer a threat. Come, Holy Spirit, come.